Hello. Warhammer has always been a game of mass combat, but with its 6th edition, that moniker would take on an even greater meaning. Finely balanced armies of ever-increasing scale would truly make this a game of fantasy battles, and for many, the greatest version of the game ever made. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today, it's time for part 5 of my making of Warhammer Fantasy. In the year 2000, Warhammer would turn 17 years and 6 editions old. Its origins are rooted in skirmish gameplay. That first edition was all about taking whatever miniatures you had and throwing them on the table. But more than that, it was about a business decision. Brian Ansell wanted a rule set that would encourage players to buy more miniatures and have an excuse to use them all anytime they wanted. Whilst the Warhammer World would revisit those skirmish origins with the specialist game Mordheim and a dedicated skirmish supplement for Warhammer, the 6th edition would drive the game to a very different place. The small-scale games of the earliest versions of Warhammer and the hero-skewed games of 4th and 5th edition would be replaced by something that was very new, and that was really very old. The historical games that had informed the creation of the original Warhammer were very much going to inform this one. Except now, we were going to get a game that was truly about ranks, flanks, and units. If you're just joining my series on the making of Warhammer for the first time, then you might want to consider checking out this video right here that covers the 1st and 2nd editions of the game. There's then a series of other videos that will bring you right up to where we are now. Or if you want to get an overview of every edition that's been released, all 8, then you can watch this overview video right here. But if you're ready for the 6th edition of the game, then you're in the right place. All you need to do now is leave a like, if you want. Over the course of the first 5 editions of Warhammer, Games Workshop had grown from a relatively small company producing and selling third-party games to a miniatures-backed behemoth, now a professional outfit fully based in Nottingham and producing 2 core games, Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000. Before the next version of Warhammer would be released, and the transition would continue into the version of Warhammer and Games Workshop that we know today, there would be a 3rd edition of the science fiction game, Warhammer 40,000. And with that 3rd edition came a revolutionary new approach, one which stripped away layers of complexity in favour of speed and accessibility. Gone were things like individual vehicle damage tables and enormously diverse army rules in favour of a more coherent and consistent rule set. In many ways, this was a brand new game, and it was one that would explode in popularity. The following year, there would be another grimdark release from Games Workshop, the post-apocalyptic skirmish game, Mordheim. If you want to hear the full making of Mordheim, you can check out my video by clicking on this link. But suffice it to say that this would be a game born out of John Blanche's unique vision of the Warhammer world, with the gameplay and narrative-first mindset of game designer Tuomas Pirinen. The game, as well as remaining popular even today, would set the tone and the team that would form the basis for the next edition of Warhammer, one that regained a certain darkness whilst deepening its narrative through its art, story, and core gameplay. After the catastrophic overproduction and underselling of Gorka Morka in 1997, there were changes to the way that Games Workshop operated and was structured, how it committed to new games, and how the design teams were expected to function. A new specialist game studio called Fnatic was created under the control of the head Fnatic, Jervis Johnson. Mordheim would be taken under the wing of Fnatic, alongside games like Inquisitor and Epic, and over the next few years, there would be regular dedicated support for all of the specialist titles in the form of themed magazines and staggered new miniature releases. Another game that ended up under the Fnatic banner was one that took Warhammer Battles to an epic new scale, the game of Warmaster. The intention of Warmaster designer Rick Priestley was to enable larger scale battles in the Warhammer world, and whilst the game received considerable support at first, it didn't have a lasting presence in GW stores. Whether this was due to the parallel attempt of the new Warhammer edition to also promote larger scale battles, or to the relatively low cost to create a balanced Warmaster army, and therefore lower profit potential, or just due to a lack of sustained consumer interest, it's difficult to say. Like Mordheim, Warmaster would join the Fnatic family as a specialist game, Fnatic having become the sanctuary for games that core GW wasn't able to or interested in supporting any longer. Despite the post-Gorka Morka restructures that had given sales a bigger role in driving future game development, the combination of Fnatic and Rick Priestley's position on the board made sure that the designers could still work on projects that excited them.
Really, it was him and Alan Merritt who interfaced with the sales and the board. And indeed, because Rick had a board seat, he would talk to the board directly. And for us creatives, Rick saw it as his job to shield us from all the things that I've worked with a lot of very big games companies now. Marketing has a lot of input, the top management has a lot of input. Rick's job was to be the shield of the studio. So what he wanted to do was to chat with Rick and be like, if you were enthusiastic about the idea and you built stuff that the interested him and the discussion sparked his imagination, he would go and fight for you. It wasn't our job to do that. It's at that point the sales team, their access cards would not work at the studio space. Like Rick was very specific about that. There was a deliberate separation of the design studio from the business side. It's something that Rick believed very passionately at that point.
With all of these games in the mix, there was an ever-present tension in Games Workshop's retail arm, revolving around their most limited and most valuable resource: shelf space. Mail order and the mail order trolls were a key sales channel, but they represented a fraction of what they would later become. At the time, Games Workshop stores and third-party vendors were absolutely essential to the business, but they were literally limited by the physical size of the store. They could only fit in as many shelves as they could fit, and every single product that was placed on those shelves had to justify its position there. Or it could be taking away space that could be better served with a product that would actually sell. It was into this context that the next edition of Warhammer was going to be released. 40k was taking off like a rocket, and circling above, there was a Nazgul on a Felbeast waiting to eat Warhammer's lunch. Warhammer Fantasy Battles was soon going to have to prove that it was the leading fantasy wargame, and that it deserved a place on the shelves. So what better way to start than by producing arguably the strongest edition of the game to date. The 6th edition of Warhammer was designed to be the definitive version of the game, one that featured balanced army lists for every major faction, characterful and diverse units and monsters, gameplay features and options that gave you many ways to play, and a host of supplements that added new lore, scenarios, and one-off ideas to elevate your gameplay. And with all of that, the lead designer Tuomas Pirinen kept in mind one key mission statement. We haven't made huge sweeping changes to the basic game, but have taken the opportunity to restore balance to the areas of the game that occasionally found themselves misused, misunderstood, or didn't quite work the way we wanted.
5th edition, there is something to be said about this crazy hero hammer, where there is just, you build the most outrageous combination of monster, hero, magic items and spells that you could ever imagine, and they just wipe away entire regiments in a single swoop. It just wasn't a vision that we were thinking of blocks of infantry. It's the flanking moves with cavalry, and this a much more grittier, down to ground fantasy world that had an aspect of believability. Is the over high fantasy.
This was not going to be a radical overhaul. This was going to be an incremental evolution like we'd seen before, but one very much intent on shifting the style of gameplay in Warhammer. This was going to take us away from herohammer and towards important units and changes to the way we played tactically. The team that was assembled behind Pirinen to deliver this version of Warhammer was in many ways even more impressive than that which had been involved in Mordheim. Alessio Cavatore had joined Games Workshop in 1996 as a translator. Rising through the design studio, Cavatore had been involved in the testing and development for a range of games, working closely with Rick Priestley on both Warmaster and The Lord of the Rings. For Warhammer, Cavatore would be one of the principal game developers, working with Jake Thornton and Nigel Stillman. Jake Thornton had already worked with Pirinen on the 5th edition campaign box, Circle of Blood, and was a White Dwarf editor. Besides his work on the core rulebook, Thornton would also write several more Warhammer Armies books for this edition. Nigel Stillman had of course worked on the past 3 editions of Warhammer, and he had produced many excellent supplements and armies books over the years. The 6th edition though would be his last with Games Workshop, and by the time the next edition released, he had already left the company. Gav Thorpe provided additional material for the core game, and would go on to become the Warhammer Loremaster for this edition, shaping a new interpretation of the world and authoring several army books himself. Over time, Thorpe would become more involved in driving fiction through Black Library novels, but before that he would be key to Warhammer in both its 6th and 7th editions. Graham McNeil, Mike Marshall, and the always incredible Space McQuirk rounded out the team. This was a talented team, though many of these writers and designers were relatively new to the design studio, having joined over the past few years. This would be the first version of Warhammer that was largely designed by people who had grown up playing the game. And whilst Pirinen has since said that a lot of the real OGs were still at the design studio, allowing him to soak in the atmosphere, this would be the changing of the guard. It would be the first version of Warhammer that did not have a development, hands-on role for Rick Priestley. Instead, he would support from afar, as both the mentor for Pirinen and as Games Workshop's Director of New Product Design, though apparently his name badge had a different title. He was the Pixie Expert. Another GW veteran who was also unavailable to support development was Jervis Johnson. He was now fully ensconced in the Fnatic offices, working on all of those specialist games. That meant that he only really had time to support some of the early concept design and a bit of playtesting. But that's not to say that there wasn't still an heavyweight with their hand on the tiller. This version of the game would benefit massively from the artistry, experience, and vision of Games Workshop art director John Blanche. Like Pirinen, Blanche was fresh off of the tour de force that was Mordheim, and he would go on to describe what he saw as the Mordheim effect or Mordheim factor. Thanks to a freer creative hand, that game had perhaps been a truer expression of Blanchian Warhammer than any before it. A vision for the game's world that was simultaneously grounded and bleak, fantastic and ornate, ridiculous and sublime. And following the creative successes of Mordheim, that same approach would bleed into the design for the 6th edition of Warhammer. This edition would have the most coherent and consistent visual representation of the Warhammer world that had yet been created, a return from, as Pirinen described it, the colourful, cartoony, kind of kiddie-friendly version of the world that had defined 4th and 5th edition. It would probably be a mistake to ignore the influence that the massive success of 3rd edition 40k may have had as well. Forsaking the Games Workshop Red period in favour of a darker, blacker, blanchier version of the grim darkness of the 41st millennium had worked wonders for sales. Perhaps things didn't need to be lighter and brighter to entice younger audiences after all. The journeys that these two editions took as they evolved from their previous incarnations would be similar in aesthetics only. Whilst 40k would significantly simplify and revise its rule set between editions, Warhammer was content not to make any huge sweeping changes. That design credo meant that the heart of the game would remain the same from 5th edition to 6th edition. There was no desire to change what had worked so well up until now. But it did seem like there was now a possibility to revert the game back to an earlier version of its art style. The 40k and Mordheim successes had created a delumination in the light. It was going to be possible to create something darker, and to that end, John Blanche created some key reference material at the start of the design process. Blanche's concept work is simply magnificent. The mythic tableaus that would serve as introduction and chapter breaks were already in his mind, with this draft of the Saga of Sigmar. Throughout the design brief, Blanche frequently describes the feeling of a sort of medieval artwork that he is striving for, with reference to the Bayeux tapestry and Celtic motifs. New maps of the Warhammer world were to be produced as if they were artifacts from within that world itself. An elven map of Ulthuan, a Skaven map of the Under Empire. There was to be storytelling within the art as well as within the words of the book. A grand new map of the old world would be created following the Mordheim style, with a border that included tools and narrative elements like an explorer reminiscing about their travels and the ship that they had travelled on. An important instruction to his design team is that all of the small illustrations, vignettes and page furniture should be more than just pretty pictures. They should all contain some kind of useful information or a narrative or an evocative colour. With Blanche setting the tone for this edition, an array of talented artists and graphic designers would help to bring that vision to life. Artists like Alex Boyd, Paul Dainton, David Gallagher, Paul Geacock, Carl Kapinski, Adrian Smith, Nuala Kennedy, John Wigley, Neil Hodgson, and Adrian Wood would all contribute interior art and design for the core book, and it was a beautiful production. Much of the book was still presented in black and white, largely due to the high cost of colour printing at the time, but it works in the game's favour, with dark shadows providing the Warhammer world with richly shaded complexion. In his concept notes, Blanche reflects on the art from previous editions, calling out his own work for being grandiose but lacking action, whilst artist Dave Gallagher's covers are full of vigour, but often composed of just a few characters. Blanche wanted this edition to feature more examples of both grandeur and action simultaneously, and with the cover to the starter box, he found a perfect example. This piece by Jeff Taylor, the artist behind Mordheim's cover and many other pieces for Games Workshop, is a wonderful example of the kind of epic action that Blanche appeared to be after, replete with scale and dynamism. The hardback rulebook cover presents the world of Warhammer as if it is another artifact from history, carved from wood and depicting a legendary conflict between orc and human. As intended by Blanche, there is a medieval quality to the design, one that flows throughout the book with the many tapestries and tableaus that adorn the pages. These borders would even feature on the covers for some of the supplements for this edition. The new starter box for this edition would feature the Empire versus Orcs, and it would have more rounded armies than we had been used to seeing in starter boxes so far. Instead of just the duo of hand weapons and archers, with the occasional splash of cavalry, this time there would be war machines and generals as well. Alongside all of the armies, you received the classic gubbins that you needed to play, the tokens, templates and dice, and a miniature rulebook. In a return to the 3rd edition approach, there would only be one single book for 6th edition. The rules, battle book and bestiary would all be found between the same covers. And there was another classic move as well. The starter box included a cut-down version of the main book, but a mighty hardcover version could also be bought separately. Whilst this gorgeous book did include many pages of rich lore, that was perhaps outweighed by a focus on crunchier content.
Rules-wise, I had a bit more constraints, obviously. At that point, the Warhammer Fantasy Battle was a huge part of the business, so there were some more, how would I say, guidance I had from Rick. And the first thing was that when I had his 2-page brief was that the Warhammer is a classic game that has stood, and we are talking about the game mechanics. That has stood the test of time. So we are not going to remake it because the feeling was that first of all we all loved Warhammer. Like the studio, fantasy was the big game at the studio in many ways. Not that 40k wasn't, but the fantasy was the gentleman's game, so to speak. So without anybody giving me orders, it was clear that the idea wasn't to throw away the Warhammer rules, but to take them into a more grounded place.
On Facebook, Pirinen has said that this edition was all about providing the players as much gaming content in the book as possible. For that reason, the book contained 9 new scenarios, terrain rules bespoke to different battlefields, like Lustrian jungles or the deserts of Khemri, a fully integrated campaign system, skirmish rules, siege rules, and a host of other mechanical odds and ends. Though the introduction once again promised that this edition would not deliver radical changes to a system which is basically sound, it was definitely a comprehensive re-presentation of the previous rule set, with plenty of minor cleanups and changes throughout, and 1 or 2 more significant reworks were in the mix as well. The structure of the book was reshaped and revised to make it easier to find key rules and interactions, and within the combat resolution rules, we would find a new concept, unit strength. This was a value that could be roughly derived from the physical size of the models of a given unit multiplied by the volume of models in that unit. Basically, the idea was that, for example, it would take fewer infantrymen to overwhelm another unit of infantrymen than it would take for that same unit of infantrymen to overwhelm and outnumber a unit of minotaurs. Because the minotaurs are bigger, so they're less likely to be afraid of the infantrymen. So you need more infantrymen. Whereas infantrymen are more likely to be overwhelmed and outnumbered by a smaller number of other infantrymen. So infantrymen and then minotaurs, if you have more of the guys, then you can outnumber. Army composition rules were also revised with a view to making armies feel more like armies and less like heroes with a couple of hangers-on. To start with, you could only take certain stronger levels of Lord characters in higher point games, and you were compelled to take a minimum number of core units. Coupled with minimum model numbers for those units, the removal from armies books of stats and points values for many special characters, and a general weakening of characters and magic items, and a limit on the number of magic items that you could take, the push away from the domination of herohammer was very clear. And this would not be the only major change either. The magic system was fully overhauled, moving away from the 4th and 5th edition card-based system to one based on dice, power dice, that was a tiny bit reminiscent of the tiny power dice you would get in Warhammer Quest. Players now accumulated a pool of power dice each turn according to the levels of the wizards in their army. This represented the ebbs and flows in the winds of magic. These dice could then be spent to attempt to cast spells. You just had to roll a combined score equal or greater than the casting value of the spell you'd chosen. But if you rolled at least 2 6s, then the spell was cast with irresistible force and couldn't be dispelled by your enemy. Inversely, roll 2 or more 1s and your wizard has suffered a catastrophic miscast and would face potentially explosive consequences. The revised magic rules also included a brutal nerf for undead armies. Fleeing or dead wizards cannot attempt to cast spells. Dead wizards. Sorry, Tomb Kings, it's in the book. Those Empire and Orc armies that were included in the starter box were interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the armies were pretty accurate representations of what would almost be the watchword for this edition: balance. The Empire army was composed of a mounted general, a great cannon with 3 crew, a unit of 18 spearmen, and a unit of 16 handgunners. That's 39 models and a total value, give or take some equipment choices, of 449 points. The Orc army features a big boss on a war boar, an Orc boar chariot, a unit of 18 boys with additional hand weapons, and a unit of 16 arrow boys. That makes for 36 models and a total army points value of 451 points. Only 2 points in it, which I think is pretty great work. The miniature kits that had been created for Mordheim the year before were the first in a new generation of multi-part plastics. Sculpted at 3 times their final size to enable scanning of all the detail, these kits paved the way for those that would be included in the 6th edition starter box. The Empire Troopers, for instance, feature multiple options, and the kit was so good it would remain in service for many years to come. As with every earlier edition of Warhammer, there would be a range of Citadel miniatures sculpted by some incredible artists. Amongst the 6th edition Citadel design and sculpting team, there were a range of familiar and new names, including Tim Adcock, Dave Andrews, Mark Bedford, Juan Diaz, Colin Dixon, Chris Fitzpatrick, Jez Goodwin, Colin Grayson, Mark Harrison, Alex Hedstrom, Shane Hoyle, Gary Morley, Ali Morrison, Trish Carden, Brian Nelson, Alan Perry, and Michael Perry. The first supplement for this edition, sort of, would take inspiration from the earliest versions of the game, a single book that would provide get-you-by army lists and points values for every army currently available. Not only did it borrow a concept from the first few versions of the game, it also borrowed its name. This would be essentially the second edition of Ravening Hordes. The booklet, written in 2 weeks, came free with White Dwarf 250 and includes lists for 15 different armies. It would start 6th edition off with a solid foundation of balanced gameplay from which to build. On the Flail of Skulls podcast, Pirinen reflected on that need for such a starting point. People want new and exciting things and new options, and we come up with new ideas and new models, and at the same time, we want people to get into those new armies. At the same time, it's so easy in a game of Warhammer with one bad design decision to completely break the game. That's why, for the 6th edition, we did the Ravening Hordes, so that was at least one set of army lists that created that one goal. So it gave us the very best possible chance of balancing everything at the same time. All of the armies that we know, love, and hate from 5th edition would get full Armies Books releases for 6th, starting with the Empire and followed by Orcs and Goblins. This new range of Armies Books would primarily be written by Thorpe, Pirinen, Priestley, Cavatore, Thornton, McQuirk, Anthony Reynolds, Pete Haynes, Matt Ward, Phil Kelly, and Steves, Pritchard, and Comiskey. Following the bifurcation of the Undead in 5th edition and the creation of the Vampire Count's dedicated armies book, the 6th edition would see a new Undead aspect given an army book of its own, the Tomb Kings. The Tomb Kings brought the dead sands of Khemri to life, filling them with skeletons, bone giants, and other nightmarish constructs. A new army would stride onto the battlefields in 6th edition, the Ogre Kingdoms. Finally, we could lead the mighty ogre hordes that had plagued the old world for as long as HeroQuest players could remember. White Dwarf provided considerable support for Warhammer 6th edition during its run, with many articles being reprinted each year in the annual and chronicle releases. Amongst the new ideas were steam tank variants, Kislevite army lists, new Chaos mutations, new Dogs of War, a steam tank demolition derby, and a Dino Jousts minigame, and all of this from just one of the Chronicles anthologies. It just felt like there was an abundance of joy and creativity in the design studio during this edition of the game. An expanded set of skirmish rules for use with Warhammer were also released, so that you could bring a little more Mordheim into your life. Even though the core book would provide ideas and rules for new territories, terrains, and battlefields, this would be expanded upon by a brace of books about the home of the Lizardmen, vampire pirates, and bubonic ratmen. Warhammer was once again setting sail for Lustria. The Lustria sourcebook was a primer on jungle fighting, featuring a host of special rules for battling through the unusual environment. Everything from keeping your black powder dry in the hostile humidity to encountering swamps, lashworms, and carnivorous plants. This setting book was supplemented by another White Dwarf booklet called Conquest of the New World, which provided special campaign rules and scenarios for armies deep in the jungle. During the 6th edition of Warhammer, there were 2 global campaigns. These were massive events where players around the world were encouraged to play games according to a certain set of rules and then submit their results to Games Workshop. There was the suggestion that all of the combined results could actually cause grave consequences for the lore of the game and advance the storyline further. During this period, there would be several 40k events, including the infamous 13th Black Crusade during the Eye of Terror event, and even Lord of the Rings would see a War of the Ring event. The first such event for 6th edition Warhammer would come in 2001, and it was called Dark Shadows. As a malevolent force began spreading across the Warhammer world, the mists surrounding the little-known Isle of Albion would part, and forces from every corner of the globe would march into battle on its shores for the first time since the Age of the Old Ones. For amongst the marshes and bogs of Blighty, Albion, there were stones that were sacred, and those powered stones were actually keeping chaos contained in the northern wastes. Some dark power was drawing together evil forces intent on destroying the stones, and possibly destroying the entire world itself. Written by Cavatore, Thornton and McQuirk from a concept by Priestley and Thorpe, a Dark Shadows campaign book was released that included the lore, rules, weather, and scenarios that you needed to participate in this global event. Every battle would see players include dark emissaries or truthsayers in their army, and the winners would contribute their victory to the total score by sending in their results to be tallied. By the end of the campaign, the forces of good just about secured victory and the stones remained intact. Chaos would stay trapped in the northern wastes, and there would be nominal changes to the lore as a result of the event. Though the Truthsayers, the Wizards of Albion, and other inhabitants of Albion like the Giants and the Fen Beasts could now be taken as dogs of war. But the world of Warhammer would grow darker still in 2004 because there was another event on the horizon. This time, everyone would face the Storm of Chaos. The Storm of Chaos event was another global campaign, and this time the stakes were sky high. Written by then Warhammer Loremaster-in-Chief Gav Thorpe, the story was set to take the old world to the brink of, if not destruction, then at the very least some light decimation and some heavy reconfigurement. This was a fantastic tale in the making. Archaon, ever chosen of Chaos, was marching on Kislev and the north of the Empire, whilst Be'lakor, the Demon Prince Dark Master responsible for the events of the Dark Shadows campaign, was now loosed from his prison, and his mood was peaked. Another campaign book was released to support the event, with lore and special rules, and it told the tale of Luther Huss, disenfranchised priest of Sigmar who believed he had found the very reincarnation of his god in the form of a warrior named Voltan. This event had everything: political unrest, epic and important battles, the threat of a significant status quo shift within the Empire. Might Karl Franz have to yield the throne? Could the city of Middenheim be destroyed? Would Grimgor Ironhide and his orcs play a pivotal and satisfying role in the plot? Well, this tale of the Storm of Chaos is a complex one. For some people, it represents the hubris of Games Workshop and their inability to adapt to player interaction. A disconnect between what people want and what Games Workshop intended. For others, this was the end times in everything but name. It was a chance to take the universe of Warhammer to the brink and test out whether or not they could destroy it satisfactorily. For still others, this was just a completely failed attempt to do something interesting, because it took the world to the precipice and then stepped back. What could have been the status quo becoming the status quo ante, and the Warhammer world becoming something completely new, was just left as it was to start with. I think there is a really interesting story around the Storm of Chaos, and I suspect I'm going to come back to it relatively soon to explore it and talk about it a little bit more. All we do know is that ultimately the entire event would be scrubbed from the records and retold in a way through the end times. In 2006, the Dwarves would receive their second 6th edition Warhammer Armies book, one that featured new rules, points values and units. Although this was released at the very end of the 6th edition life cycle, it was, for all intents and purposes, the first Armies book designed with 7th edition Warhammer in mind. As a result, it was considered by many to be vastly overpowered when compared to the other Armies books from 6th edition. A bit like a night on the Troll Brew, this book gave you something of a headache. And with that perhaps unfortunate release, the end of 6th edition was nigh. The following year, 7th edition would hit shelves, and whilst many things would change, a lot of things would stay the same. At the start of the new millennium, shortly after the release of 6th edition Warhammer, Rick Priestley and Andy Jones had convinced the board that they should convince New Line Cinema to give them the license for Lord of the Rings. New Line had been developing a large-scale adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and after Priestley, Jones, and John Blanche flew out to LA, they were able to secure the license for Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Rings. This new miniatures game could draw on anything from this New Line movie, but not from the wider world of Tolkien or even from the sequels. The story of what would become the Middle-earth strategy battle game is probably for another time, but it is worth noting that with specialist games in the hands of Fnatic, the Lord of the Rings game had become the third core game system supported by the GW Design Studio. Rick Priestley, in an interview with the Battle Games on Middle-earth YouTube channel, explained that there was a hefty license fee to pay on the game. So for that reason, miniatures were cast at a slightly smaller production cost saving scale, and even with that 8% license fee, the margins and sales for the Lord of the Rings game meant that it was more profitable for Games Workshop than Warhammer Fantasy Battles was. For 6 years, the 6th edition of Warhammer held high the fantasy standard against the great guns of 40k, the power of the One Ring, and the shifting tastes of players. For many people, Warhammer 6th edition became exactly what Tuomas Pirinen had intended, the definitive version of Warhammer, with reasonably well balanced armies, and more of them than ever before, a game that could support open battlefields, skirmishes, and siege warfare, a blend of low fantasy fundamentals with high fantasy flourish, a focus on the core units of an army rather than the heroes and an overpowered meta, and all of it wrapped in a dark and brutally beautiful vision of the Warhammer world. And it was a strong enough offering to lead a longer and arguably more fruitful life than any edition before it. But that tension in GW retail was tighter than ever. There was still only so much shelf space available, and now there were 3 core games competing for it. During the run of 6th edition, Tuomas Pirinen left Games Workshop and headed to a career in video games. Speaking on the Flail of Skulls podcast of his decision to leave the worlds and games that he loved, Pirinen said, "To be brutally blunt, at that point, even on a position that was pretty decent, Games Workshop just wasn't paying much to their game designers, and I wanted to own a house and start a family and take care of the people around me. And the video games industry just pays so much better. It was a painful but rational choice." I think it's fair to say that whilst he was with Games Workshop, Tuomas Pirinen made an incredible contribution to the games that we love. He has had a massive impact. Mordheim is still much loved and much played today. Warhammer 6th edition is considered by many to be the definitive version of the game. He is owed an incredible debt of thanks for all of that awesome work. And of course, he didn't do it alone. And there is that triumvirate of Pirinen, Blanche, and Priestley, who together delivered some incredible gameplay and awesome experiences. As well as all of the other creative talent involved, we definitely should thank them all for all of the stuff that they gave us over the years. It was great. And yet the future for Warhammer and Games Workshop itself was about to get grimmer and darker. Tom Kirby, in his myriad leadership positions, had big ideas for the company, but small ideas for its stores. And he also had a little black book. I hope that you've enjoyed my making of Warhammer 6th edition. If you did, please feel free to leave a like, to leave a comment, and to subscribe to the channel. I appreciate all of that stuff. If you want to support the channel even more and you've got the means and inclination, then please feel free to check out my Patreon via the link in the description below. You will be rewarded with access to behind the scenes blog posts, to exclusive videos like the rest of my interview with Tuomas Pirinen, and you get to vote on what topics I will cover in future videos. You will also earn my undying gratitude. I also want to thank Tuomas Pirinen for taking the time out to allow me to interview him and for providing so many interesting and insightful bits of information and answers to my rambling questions. Thank you very much for watching. I am Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. During Pirinen's tenure, the Warhammer world would experience 2 apocalypses, and it would come out creatively stronger from both of them. Whether the same could be said about other impending Warhammer apocalypses, well, I guess we'll find out relatively soon. Ish.